My wife Kendra vanished for 4 entire days, leaving me frantically calling hospitals and filing missing person reports. I was convinced something terrible had happened to her, but when I finally tracked her down at her friend's house, she wasn't kidnapped or hurt. She was perfectly fine and absolutely furious with me. Turns out her disappearance was completely planned. She wanted to teach me a lesson about appreciation by putting me through the worst 4 days of my life. What I didn't know yet was that her friends had been secretly filming my breakdown the whole time, but nothing prepared me for her punchline. Let me tell you how this nightmare started. The morning that started my nightmare. Tuesday morning started like any other day in our 6-year marriage. I'd wake up at 6:30, grab coffee, kiss Kendra goodbye while she was still in bed, and head to the office. She'd usually text me around 10 a.m. about her plans for the day. Except this Tuesday, my phone stayed silent. No good morning text, no random thoughts about dinner plans, no complaints about the neighbor's dog barking too early. I figured she was sleeping in or maybe had plans she forgot to mention. Kendra sometimes visited her mom on weekdays or met up with her friend group for coffee. She didn't need to report her every move to me, and I wasn't the type of husband who needed constant updates. We trusted each other, and adults don't need permission slips to leave the house. When I got home that evening around 6 p.m., the house felt different. Not dramatically different, just quiet in a way that made me pause at the front door. Kendra's car wasn't in the driveway, which wasn't unusual, but something felt off. I called out her name as I walked in, expecting to hear her voice from the kitchen or living room. Nothing. I checked the obvious places first. Maybe she was napping or taking a shower. The bedroom was empty, bathroom too. Her side of the bed was made, which was normal, but her phone charger was gone from the nightstand. That's when I noticed the suitcase missing from our closet. The medium-sized one we used for weekend trips. My brain immediately started cycling through reasonable explanations. Her sister lived 3 hours away and sometimes needed help with her kids. Maybe there was a family emergency she forgot to tell me about. Or maybe she decided to surprise her mom with a spontaneous visit. Kendra could be impulsive like that, especially when she felt cooped up at home for too long. I sent her a text asking if everything was okay and where she was. Then I called. Straight to voicemail. I left a message trying to sound casual, like I wasn't slowly transforming into a worried husband stereotype. Maybe her phone died, or she left it on silent. People survived for decades without being constantly reachable. She'd probably call me back within an hour with some perfectly logical explanation that would make me feel silly for worrying. But 8 p.m. came and went with no response. Then 9 p.m. By 10 p.m., I was refreshing my phone every few minutes, checking to see if I'd somehow missed her text or call. I had Google searched kidnapping hotlines, convinced I'd missed the memo on home and visibility hacks. My brain was crafting increasingly dramatic scenarios. Maybe she decided to book a spa weekend and forgot to mention it. Some spas had strict no-phone policies, right? Wednesday morning arrived with still no word from Kendra. I called in sick to work, which I never do, because I couldn't concentrate on spreadsheets when my wife had apparently evaporated into thin air. I tried calling her again. Voicemail. I texted her mom, trying to sound casual while fishing for information. Her mom hadn't heard from her either and seemed confused about why I was asking. I played it off like I was just checking if they had plans I forgot about. By Wednesday afternoon, my reasonable explanations were getting more creative. Maybe she ran into an old friend and they decided to have an impromptu girls' weekend. Maybe she was planning a surprise for our anniversary, which wasn't for another 4 months, but perhaps she was really organized this year. I was grasping at increasingly ridiculous straws while trying to convince myself this was normal behavior. Wednesday evening brought a new level of concern. I started calling her friends, which felt weird, because I barely knew most of them. I had to explain who I was and why I was looking for my own wife, which made me sound like either a controlling husband or a complete idiot. None of them had heard from Kendra recently. They all seemed genuinely surprised that I didn't know where she was, which made me feel even more stupid for not keeping better track of her daily activities. Thursday morning, I woke up to the same empty house and the same silent phone. This wasn't a spa day or a surprise anniversary planning session. This was becoming something else entirely. I called her sister directly, abandoning any pretense of casual inquiry. Her sister hadn't heard from Kendra either, and started asking me questions I couldn't answer. Had we been fighting? Was she upset about something? Did she seem different lately? I found myself defending our marriage to her sister while simultaneously wondering if I'd missed some obvious signs that Kendra was unhappy. The house felt like a crime scene where nothing had actually been stolen. I walked through every room looking for clues about where she might have gone. Her toiletries were mostly still there, but her favorite shampoo was missing. Her jewelry box looked normal, but I couldn't remember which earrings she usually wore. I was trying to be a detective in my own home, analyzing evidence about a person I'd been married to for 6 years. By Thursday afternoon, I was Googling things like how long before someone is considered missing and what to do when your spouse disappears. The internet was full of horror stories and legal advice that made everything seem more serious. I started making lists of hospitals to call, wondering if she'd been in an accident and somehow lost her ID. Maybe she was unconscious somewhere, unable to tell doctors who she was or who to contact. Thursday evening, I realized I was no longer making excuses for normal behavior. I was trying to solve a mystery that had no logical explanation. Adults don't just vanish for 3 days without telling anyone where they're going. Something was wrong, and I needed to figure out exactly what that something was. When worry becomes full-scale detective mode, I transformed from concerned husband into full-blown amateur detective operating out of my own living room. I sat at our kitchen table with a notepad, writing down names of every person Kendra had ever mentioned in casual conversation. I was about to start cold calling people based on the contact list in her phone, which I'd never looked at before and felt creepy accessing now. I cold called half her contacts, from book club to dental hygienist, each one more bewildered than the last. Every call went straight to voicemail or ended with awkward explanations about who I was and why I was looking for my own wife. Jessica from our old book club seemed genuinely confused about why I didn't know where Kendra was, which made me feel pathetic. She hadn't heard from Kendra in over a week and asked if we'd been fighting. I found myself defending our marriage to someone who barely knew us, while simultaneously wondering if I'd missed some obvious marital red flags. The conversations followed the same humiliating pattern. I'd have to explain our entire relationship dynamic to justify why I was calling about Kendra's whereabouts. Her former coworkers barely remembered her, which made sense since she'd left years ago, but I was grasping at every possible connection. One woman remembered Kendra mentioning she wanted to travel more, which sent me spiraling into theories about spontaneous road trips or secret vacation plans. The calls to her gym friends were particularly humiliating because I had to describe Kendra to people who saw her more regularly than I did. They knew her workout schedule better than I knew her daily routine, which made me realize how little attention I'd been paying to her actual life. One woman mentioned that Kendra sometimes talked about feeling stuck in a rut, which triggered a whole new wave of paranoid theories about midlife crises and secret dissatisfaction with our marriage. By Friday morning, I was calling hospitals with the systematic approach of someone who'd watched too many crime documentaries. I had a script prepared about my missing wife and practiced ways to describe her without sounding like a complete lunatic. The hospital staff were polite but unhelpful, explaining that they couldn't give out patient information without proper identification. I found myself arguing with nurses about privacy laws while my wife was potentially lying unconscious somewhere with amnesia. I started driving around town looking for her car, which turned me into a neighborhood creep who slowly cruised past strip malls and coffee shops. I checked every grocery store parking lot, every Target, every place she might reasonably go on a normal day. I was operating on the theory that maybe she'd had some kind of breakdown and was living in her car, too embarrassed to come home. The search through our house became increasingly frantic and invasive. I went through her drawers looking for clues, reading old journals, and checking her browser history like a private investigator. I found notes about redecorating the living room and Amazon searches for throw pillows, which seemed like evidence of someone planning to stay in the marriage, not flee from it. Every normal piece of evidence contradicted my growing fears that she'd been secretly planning to leave me. I called her old college roommate in Chicago, who I'd never spoken to before but whose number I found in Kendra's address book. That conversation was surreal because I had to explain 6 years of marriage to someone who knew Kendra from before we met. Her roommate kept asking if Kendra had mentioned feeling isolated or wanting to reconnect with old friends, which made me paranoid that Kendra had been reaching out to her support network without telling me. Friday evening, I started calling emergency rooms in neighboring towns, expanding my search radius like I was looking for a lost pet. I gave the same description of Kendra over and over until it started sounding mechanical and weird. The staff at each hospital were professionally sympathetic but clearly dealing with someone who was losing his grip on reality. I started carrying a recent photo of Kendra in case someone needed visual confirmation, which made me feel like I was starring in a missing person documentary. The breakthrough came when I called her friend Monica, who I'd only met once at a wedding. Monica's voice wobbled when I mentioned Kendra's name, and she paused just long enough to make me suspicious. She claimed she hadn't heard from Kendra recently, but something about her tone made me think she was lying. I pressed her for details, asking if Kendra had mentioned any plans or seemed upset about anything. Monica kept insisting she didn't know anything, but she sounded nervous and eager to get off the phone. That phone call triggered a whole new level of paranoia. If Monica was lying, maybe other people were too. Maybe Kendra had specifically asked her friends not to tell me where she was, which meant this wasn't an accident or emergency. Maybe she was avoiding me intentionally, which opened up terrifying possibilities about the state of our marriage that I'd been completely oblivious to. I started reviewing every conversation we'd had over the past month, looking for signs that Kendra was unhappy or planning to leave. I remembered her mentioning that she felt bored sometimes, but I'd assumed that was normal for someone who didn't work outside the home. She'd occasionally make comments about wanting more excitement in her life, but I thought she meant hobbies or social activities, not escape from our marriage. By Saturday morning, I was operating on 3 hours of sleep and convinced that everyone in Kendra's social circle was part of some conspiracy to keep me in the dark. I'd created elaborate theories about secret meetings and hidden communications. The realization that this wasn't just unusual behavior, but something completely unprecedented in our relationship hit me like a physical blow. Kendra had never disappeared before, never gone more than a day without contact, never made me worry like this. Whatever was happening, it was intentional, planned, and designed to make me suffer. I needed help beyond my amateur detective skills. It was time to make this official, the police report that made everything real. Walking into the police station felt like crossing into a different reality where my personal crisis became official paperwork. The desk sergeant handed me a clipboard with forms asking for details I'd never thought to memorize about my own wife. Kendra's exact height and weight, identifying marks, her social security number. I found myself guessing at basic information about the person I'd been married to for 6 years. Officer Martinez called my name after 20 minutes of form filling that made my situation feel simultaneously more official and more ridiculous. He listened politely as I explained the whole situation, taking notes and asking clarifying questions that made me realize how little concrete evidence I had that something was actually wrong. The conversation took a turn when Officer Martinez explained that adults have the legal right to disappear whenever they want. Unless there's evidence of foul play, adults have the right to vanish, he said in the same tone you'd use to explain that stores close on Sundays. Apparently, taking your belongings and car and leaving without telling anyone isn't actually a crime when you're a grown adult. I tried to explain that this behavior was completely unlike Kendra, that she'd never gone a day without contact before. Officer Martinez nodded sympathetically, but kept returning to the same points. She'd taken her belongings voluntarily. She'd driven away in her own car. There were no signs of struggle at our house. From a legal standpoint, Kendra had exercised her right to go wherever she wanted without reporting her location to anyone, including her husband. The frustration was building in my chest like pressure in a kettle. I found myself arguing with a police officer about my own wife's behavior, trying to convince him that her disappearance was suspicious when all the evidence suggested she'd left on purpose. He asked whether we'd been fighting recently, if she seemed unhappy, if there were any marital problems. I insisted it wasn't her style. He gently demolished my case with actual law. Officer Martinez explained. There's standard procedure for missing person cases involving adults who appear to have left voluntarily. They'd enter Kendra's information into their system, check with local hospitals and morgues, and keep the case open for investigation Unless new evidence emerged suggesting she was in danger or had been the victim of a crime, there wasn't much else they could do immediately. The paperwork felt both validating and humiliating. I was officially reporting that something was wrong, which meant my concerns were being taken seriously enough to generate a case number and file. But I was also admitting to strangers that I had no idea where my wife was or why she'd left, which made me feel like I'd failed at the most basic requirement of being a husband. Officer Martinez asked for recent photos of Kendra, which I realized I didn't have on my phone. Most of our pictures were on her phone or stored on her laptop, which meant I had to describe my wife's appearance from memory while a police officer wrote down details for an official report. I found myself struggling to remember exactly what she'd been wearing the last time I saw her, which was apparently Tuesday morning when I'd kissed her goodbye without paying attention to her outfit. The questions about our relationship dynamics were particularly awkward. Had Kendra mentioned feeling trapped or wanting more independence? Did she have access to her own money and bank accounts? Were there any controlling behaviors in our marriage that might explain why she'd leave without warning? I kept insisting that our relationship was normal and healthy, but having to defend my marriage to a police officer made me question whether I'd been missing obvious signs of problems. Officer Martinez gave me his card and explained that I should call immediately if Kendra contacted me, or if I discovered any new information about her whereabouts. He mentioned that filing a false report was a crime, which I assumed was his standard warning to make sure I wasn't wasting police resources on some elaborate marital drama. The implication was clear. If Kendra showed up tomorrow, having spent the week at a spa, I'd look like either a paranoid husband or someone who didn't understand his own marriage. I wrote down the case number on the back of his card, figuring I'd need to reference it later. The number made everything feel real, in a way that scared me more than the uncertainty of the past 3 days. Walking out of the police station, I felt simultaneously validated and terrified. I'd officially reported my wife missing, which meant my concerns were serious enough to warrant police attention. But I'd also involved law enforcement in what might turn out to be a simple misunderstanding, which would be embarrassing beyond belief. The drive home was surreal. Kendra's disappearance was now part of an official police investigation, which meant this situation had crossed a line from personal crisis to legal matter. Whatever was happening, it was about to get a lot more complicated. But sitting in my driveway, staring at the case number on Officer Martinez's card, I realized the police weren't going to solve this mystery anytime soon. They'd made it clear that unless Kendra turned up dead or kidnapped, this was basically a waiting game. I couldn't just sit around hoping she'd call or come home on her own schedule. If I wanted answers, I was going to have to find them myself. The Great Neighborhood Search Mission. Saturday afternoon, I decided to take control of this situation myself. I had a plan that seemed completely logical at the time. Systematically drive through every neighborhood in our area until I found Kendra's car. I drove every lot within a 5-mile radius, 2 hours, 50 square miles, 0 sightings. My first stop was the shopping center 3 blocks away, where I drove up and down every row of the parking lot like I was conducting a military operation. A security guard watched me through the window of the mall entrance, probably wondering why this guy was driving in circles around the parking lot at 5 miles per hour. I waved at him like everything was normal, which probably made me look even more suspicious. The grocery store parking lot was next, and that's where I encountered my first concerned neighbor. Mrs. Henderson from 2 streets over knocked on my car window while I was scanning the rows of vehicles. She asked if I was looking for a parking spot, and I had to explain that I was actually looking for my wife's car because she'd been missing for 4 days. Mrs. Henderson's expression shifted from helpful to deeply concerned, and she started asking questions about whether I'd called the police and if Kendra was okay. I found myself giving her the entire story right there in the middle of the parking lot, which made me realize how crazy I probably sounded. The real comedy started when I began checking residential neighborhoods, driving slowly down streets I'd never been on before. I realized I looked like either a lost delivery driver or someone casing houses for a robbery. A woman walking her dog stopped and stared at me as I crept past her house for the 3rd time, trying to get a better look at the car in her driveway. I rolled down my window and called out that I was looking for my wife's car, which probably made me sound like either a stalker or someone having a mental breakdown. My rational search plan started falling apart when I found myself checking the same locations multiple times. I kept thinking maybe I'd missed something the first time, or maybe Kendra's car had appeared since my last visit. I was operating on the logic that if I just looked hard enough, I'd eventually find what I was looking for, even though I had no evidence that Kendra was anywhere in the area. The paranoia kicked in around hour 3 of my search mission. I started noticing people watching me from their windows and wondering if they knew something I didn't. When I saw 2 women talking in a driveway and glancing at my car, I became convinced they were discussing Kendra's disappearance. I actually considered pulling over and asking them if they'd seen her, but I realized that would probably result in someone calling the police about a suspicious man harassing neighborhood residents. The awkward encounters with strangers multiplied as my search continued. A man at a gas station asked if I needed directions because I'd been sitting in my car staring at the parking lot for 10 minutes. I explained that I was looking for my wife's car, and he offered to help me search, which was kind of him, but also made me feel pathetic. 2 people were now walking around a gas station looking for a car that probably wasn't there, and I was the reason the stranger was wasting his Saturday afternoon. I started developing increasingly elaborate theories about where Kendra might be hiding. Maybe she was staying at a hotel under a fake name. Maybe she was parked behind a building where I couldn't see her car from the street. Maybe she was moving from location to location to avoid being found. I was creating spy movie scenarios in my head while driving around suburban neighborhoods like a lost pizza delivery driver. The strangest part was how normal everyone else's Saturday looked. Families were having barbecues, kids were playing in yards, people were washing their cars and mowing their lawns. I was having the worst week of my life, but the rest of the world was just continuing with their regular weekend activities. I felt like I was watching normal life through the windshield of my car, while existing in some parallel universe where wives just disappeared without explanation. After 4 hours of systematic searching that had turned into aimless wandering, I was ready to admit defeat. I attracted suspicious looks from dozens of strangers and was starting to accept that my wife wasn't just hiding somewhere in our general area, waiting to be discovered by her increasingly frantic husband driving around in circles. Just when I was about to collapse in despair, I turned down Maple Street, a quiet residential area about 15 minutes from our house. I was barely paying attention anymore, just driving because I didn't want to go home to an empty house. And there it was, sitting in the driveway of a house I'd never seen before. Kendra's silver Honda Civic parked like it belonged there, like this was the most natural thing in the world. I pulled over and sat there staring at her car for probably 2 full minutes trying to process what I was seeing. Relief, mixed with confusion, mixed with a new kind of anxiety about what I was going to find when I knocked on that door. After 4 days of searching, the awkward doorstep confrontation, but now I had no idea. Standing on that doorstep, staring at Kendra's car, felt like the end of a 4-day nightmare and the beginning of something potentially worse. The relief was overwhelming at first. She was alive, she was safe, she hadn't been kidnapped or murdered or lying in a hospital somewhere with amnesia. But as I walked up to the front door, that relief started mixing with confusion and a growing sense that something was seriously wrong with this whole situation. I knocked on the door with the kind of urgent politeness you use when you're trying not to completely lose your mind in public. Claudia opened it, and her face immediately told me everything I needed to know about how awkward this was about to get. She looked like someone who'd been caught stealing office supplies, all wide-eyed and fidgety. Her smile was the kind of forced expression people wear when they're trying to pretend everything is normal while their world is collapsing around them. "Hi, Tom," she said, and even those 2 words sounded strained. She was blocking the doorway with her body, which seemed like a weird way to greet someone whose wife had been missing for 4 days. I asked if Kendra was there, and Claudia did this thing where she opened her mouth, but no words came out. The pause stretched long enough to become uncomfortable for both of us. I could practically see the gears turning in her head as she tried to figure out what to say. She kept glancing back into the house like she was getting instructions from someone, which made me wonder who else was involved in whatever was happening here. Finally, she managed to say that Kendra was there, but she said it like she was confessing to a crime. That's when Kendra appeared behind Claudia, and the emotional whiplash nearly knocked me over. The relief of seeing her alive and unharmed was immediately replaced by total confusion about why she looked annoyed to see me. She wasn't running toward me with tears of joy. She wasn't explaining where she'd been or apologizing for making me worry. She was standing there with her arms crossed, looking at me like I was the one who'd done something wrong. I nearly hugged her until I saw the glare. My hero had become my torment her. I asked what the hell was going on, why she hadn't called, if she was okay. All the questions that had been building up for 4 days came pouring out at once. Kendra's response was to look even more irritated, which made absolutely no sense given the circumstances. I was the one who'd been filing missing person reports and calling hospitals. I was the one who'd spent 4 days convinced something terrible had happened to her. But somehow, I was getting the look that wives usually reserve for husbands who forget to take out the trash. Claudia was practically vibrating with discomfort during this whole exchange. She kept avoiding eye contact with me, which suggested she knew more about the situation than she was letting on. Her role in this situation was becoming clearer by the minute, and it wasn't making her happy. She was stuck between her loyalty to Kendra and the obvious fact that I was the confused victim in whatever was happening here. The absurdity of the situation was starting to hit me. I was standing on a stranger's doorstep, having to negotiate with my own wife through a third party. Claudia was acting like a diplomatic mediator between two hostile countries, except one of those countries was completely clueless about why there was a conflict in the first place. I found myself looking back and forth between Kendra and Claudia, trying to understand the dynamic that had developed while I was going out of my mind with worry. Kendra finally said we needed to talk, but she said it in the tone you'd use to tell someone they were about to be fired. There was no warmth, no recognition of what I'd been through, no acknowledgement that her disappearance had been anything more than a minor inconvenience. She was treating me like I was overreacting to a perfectly normal situation, which made me feel like I was losing my grip on reality. When I asked her again why she hadn't called, why she'd let me worry for 4 days, why she'd made me file a missing person report, she just said, "We'll talk at home," and folded her arms like a traffic cop issuing a ticket. I was the one who'd been victimized by her disappearance, but somehow I was being treated like the person who'd done something wrong. Claudia looked relieved when Kendra said she was coming home with me, probably because it meant she could stop being the uncomfortable middleman in whatever marital drama was unfolding on her front porch. But her relief was mixed with something that looked like guilt, which made me wonder exactly what role she'd played in Kendra's 4-day disappearance. The walk back to my car was surreal. Kendra was walking beside me like nothing had happened, while I was still processing the fact that she'd been perfectly fine this whole time. I kept waiting for her to start explaining, but she was silent in a way that felt deliberate rather than natural. It was like she was making me wait for answers as part of some larger plan that I didn't understand yet. The drive home was filled with the kind of tension that makes you aware of every sound in the car. Kendra stared out the window while I tried to process the fact that my missing wife had been found safe and sound but was acting angry with me for finding her. The relief of knowing she was alive was being replaced by a growing anxiety about what she was going to tell me when we got home. I kept glancing at her during red lights, trying to read her expression. She was giving me nothing. She looked like someone who'd been planning this conversation for a while and was waiting for the right moment to have it. The anticipation was worse than the uncertainty of the past 4 days, because now I knew something was definitely wrong, but I had no idea what it was. As we pulled into our driveway, I realized that finding Kendra was just the beginning of this nightmare, not the end. Whatever she was about to tell me was going to explain 4 days of hell, and based on her attitude, I had a feeling I wasn't going to like the explanation at all. The life lesson that broke my brain. We sat down in our living room, and Kendra looked at me with the kind of serious expression you'd use to deliver news about a terminal diagnosis. Except, instead of cancer, she was about to tell me that my 4-day nightmare had been completely intentional. She said she needed to show me what life would be like without her and make me appreciate everything she does around the house. I sat there staring at her, waiting for the punchline or the explanation that would make this make sense, but she was completely serious. My brain basically short-circuited, trying to process what she was telling me. She'd planned this whole thing. The disappearance, the silence, the suitcase staying at Claudia's house while I called hospitals and filed police reports. She'd orchestrated every moment of my panic for the past 4 days as some kind of twisted educational experience. I asked her to repeat what she'd just said because I was convinced I'd misunderstood something fundamental about her explanation. Kendra started explaining her logic like she was presenting a business proposal. She said she'd tried to talk to me about feeling unappreciated, but I never listened, so this was the only way to get through to me. She needed me to understand how much work she does and how I take it for granted. She was delivering this explanation in the same tone you'd use to describe why you chose a particular restaurant for dinner, like causing someone to think their spouse was dead was a reasonable problem-solving strategy. I pointed out that she could have just talked to me directly if she felt unappreciated, but she brushed that off like I'd suggested something ridiculous. She insisted she'd run out of patience after trying subtle hints and comments that I'd apparently missed completely. According to her, disappearing for 4 days was the logical next step when normal communication failed. I felt like I'd been cast in a relationship drama gone rogue. No script, no director, just the villainous wife. The disconnect between her perception and my reality was becoming more obvious with every word she spoke. She was treating household chores like they were matters of national security, while I was still trying to understand how doing laundry justified psychological torture. She talked about cleaning the bathroom and cooking dinner like they were heroic acts that deserved daily recognition and gratitude. I do appreciate what she does, but I also work 50-plus hours a week to support us both financially. Kendra continued her explanation with the kind of systematic approach you'd use to teach a child why they shouldn't touch a hot stove. She said she needed me to experience life without her contributions, so I'd understand their value. She'd planned to stay away for exactly 4 days, which she'd calculated would be long enough to make her point without causing permanent damage to our relationship. The fact that she'd put a specific timeline on my suffering made the whole thing feel even more manipulative and calculated. I asked her if she'd considered that I might call the police, and she said she'd hoped I wouldn't go that far. She'd assumed I'd just worry and maybe call her friends, but she hadn't planned for me to involve law enforcement. This revealed that she'd created an elaborate plan to mess with my head, but hadn't thought through the obvious consequences of making someone think their spouse had vanished. She seemed annoyed that I had escalated the situation beyond her intended parameters. The casual way she discussed putting me through 4 days of hell was almost as disturbing as the plan itself. She talked about my panic like it was a minor inconvenience rather than genuine emotional trauma. She seemed to that because her intentions were to improve our relationship, the methods she'd used were justified. It was like she'd convinced herself that psychological manipulation was just another form of marriage counseling. Kendra's expectation that I'd be grateful for this lesson was perhaps the most insane part of her entire explanation. She seemed to think that once I understood her reasoning, I'd thank her for opening my eyes to how much she contributes to our household. She was waiting for me to have some kind of epiphany about her value, but all I could think about was how she'd deliberately made me suffer for days to prove a point about housework. The more she talked, the more I realized this wasn't just bad judgment or a communication breakdown. This was something much more concerning. She'd planned and executed a campaign of psychological manipulation with the same level of detail most people use to plan surprise parties. She'd anticipated my reactions, chosen her hiding spot, and maintained radio silence while I spiraled into panic. This required a level of calculation and cruelty that I'd never seen from her before. I kept trying to understand how someone arrives at disappearing for 4 days as a reasonable solution to feeling unappreciated. She talked about it like it was an obvious next step, like every wife who feels taken for granted should consider vanishing without a trace to teach their husband a lesson. The logic was so fundamentally flawed that I started questioning whether I'd ever really known the person I'd married. Kendra seemed frustrated that I wasn't having the reaction she'd expected. She had apparently assumed I'd be overwhelmed with gratitude and newfound appreciation for everything she does. Instead, I was sitting there trying to process the fact that my wife was capable of planning and executing something this manipulative. She kept asking if I understood her point, but the only thing I understood was that normal people don't resolve relationship issues by staging their own disappearances. The conversation kept going in circles because Kendra was operating from the premise that her methods were justified by her intentions, while I was trying to explain that making someone think their spouse was dead was never an appropriate teaching tool. She'd created this elaborate scenario in her head where I'd learned my lesson and we'd emerge from this experience with a stronger marriage, but she hadn't considered the possibility that I'd lose all trust in her judgment and her capacity for empathy. By the time she finished her basic explanation, I realized she was just getting started. She had apparently prepared much more detailed reasoning for why this extreme measure had been necessary, and she was settling in to deliver what looked like a comprehensive presentation about my failures as a husband. The appreciation lecture I never asked for. Kendra launched into what can only be described as the most detailed PowerPoint presentation about domestic labor that I'd ever been forced to sit through. She had clearly been preparing the speech for weeks, maybe months, cataloging every single thing she did around the house and every perceived slight I'd committed against her contributions. She broke down toilets, dishes, laundry, grocery runs, scheduling, each with military precision. She started with the bathroom, explaining how she scrubs the toilet, cleans the mirror, and organizes the medicine cabinet every week. She talked about bathroom maintenance like she was diffusing bombs rather than wiping down surfaces. She moved on to the kitchen, where apparently I'd been committing daily acts of domestic terrorism by leaving coffee mugs in the sink overnight. Kendra described her dishwashing routine with surgical precision, mentioning the specific brand of dish soap she uses and the optimal water temperature for different types of dishes. My attempts to interrupt and explain that I do appreciate what she does were met with increasingly dramatic examples of my supposed failures. She brought up the time 2 months ago when I'd forgotten to put the toilet seat down, which she'd apparently been storing in her mental filing cabinet of grievances. She described finding the toilet seat up like it was evidence of deep disrespect for her existence, not just a minor bathroom etiquette oversight. The laundry segment included a detailed breakdown of sorting clothes by color and fabric type, plus her expertise in folding fitted sheets like it was an Olympic sport that deserved international recognition. She mentioned that I sometimes leave my socks on the bedroom floor, which she'd elevated to the status of a personal attack on her dignity rather than just normal human messiness. The grocery shopping portion covered meal planning, creating shopping lists, comparing prices, and navigating crowded stores to keep our household fed. I tried to defend myself by pointing out that I worked 50-plus hours a week to financially support both of us, but Kendra dismissed this like my job was some kind of hobby I pursued for personal entertainment. She seemed to think that because her work happened inside our house, it was somehow more valuable or demanding than my office job. She talked about vacuuming like it was manual labor that required superhuman strength and endurance, not just pushing a machine across carpet for 20 minutes. The most absurd part of her presentation was how she treated routine household maintenance like it was skilled labor that required years of training and expertise. She explained how she changes light bulbs, waters plants, and organizes closets like these were complex technical skills that I couldn't possibly understand or appreciate. She was describing basic adult responsibilities like they were heroic acts of service that deserved daily recognition and gratitude. Kendra's voice got more passionate as she described the emotional labor of remembering birthdays, scheduling appointments, and maintaining social relationships with our extended family. She talked about calling my mother occasionally like it was diplomatic work between hostile nations rather than normal family interaction. She seemed to think that because she handled most of the social coordination in our marriage, she was carrying an unbearable emotional burden that I was too selfish to recognize. The timeline of her planning became clear as she continued her lecture. She'd been documenting my alleged failures for months, building a case for why extreme measures were necessary to educate me about her contributions. She talked about her preparation like she was describing a research project, explaining how she'd observed my behavior and concluded that disappearing was the only way to make me understand her perspective. I asked her again why she couldn't have just talked to me about feeling unappreciated, and she insisted she had tried, but I never listened. She claimed she'd been dropping hints and making comments about household responsibilities that I'd apparently missed or ignored. She was operating from the assumption that subtle communication about relationship issues was equivalent to direct conversation, and my failure to interpret her hints justified psychological warfare. Kendra seemed genuinely surprised that I wasn't grateful for this educational experience. She'd apparently expected me to have some kind of revelation about her value and start thanking her for opening my eyes to domestic reality. She was waiting for me to apologize for taking her for granted and promise to be more appreciative in the future. She seemed confused that I was focused on the trauma she'd caused rather than the lesson she'd intended to teach. The disconnect between her intentions and the actual impact of her actions was becoming more obvious with every word she spoke. She kept asking if I understood her point, but the only thing I understood was that normal people don't resolve relationship issues by staging elaborate disappearances. She was treating my 4 days of panic like they were a minor inconvenience rather than genuine emotional trauma that she deliberately inflicted. Kendra's expectation that I'd be thankful for this lesson was perhaps the most disturbing aspect of her entire explanation. She seemed to think that because her goal was to improve our relationship, the methods she'd used were justified. She talked about making me think she was dead like it was just another form of relationship counseling, not psychological abuse disguised as education. The more she talked, the more I realized that no amount of appreciation could justify what she put me through. She could have talked to me about feeling unappreciated. She could have suggested we redistribute household chores or find other ways to recognize her contributions. Instead, she'd chosen to terrorize me for 4 days to prove a point about bathroom cleaning and dishwashing. By the time she finished her presentation, I understood that this wasn't about appreciation at all. This was about control, manipulation, and a complete breakdown of healthy communication in our marriage. She turned our relationship into a psychological experiment where I was the unwilling subject, and she was the researcher documenting my responses to deliberately inflicted trauma. But as Kendra wrapped up her domestic labor manifesto, something else was starting to dawn on me. Her little disappearing act hadn't just affected our relationship. There were going to be real-world consequences to deal with, and I had a sinking feeling she hadn't thought through any of them. The missing person report aftermath. Calling back to retract the report was the pinnacle of my humiliation. I had to explain to the desk sergeant that my wife had returned home safe and sound, and that she'd never actually been missing in the first place. The officer asked if she'd been found or if she'd returned on her own, and I had to say that she'd been at her friend's house the entire time by choice. There was this pause on the other end of the line, and I could practically hear the officer trying to process what I was telling him. When I explained that Kendra had staged her disappearance intentionally, the officer's tone changed completely. He asked me to repeat what I'd said, and I had to go through the whole story again about how this was a planned lesson to make me appreciate household chores. The officer was clearly trying to remain professional, but I could tell he was struggling with the concept that someone would file a missing person report for what was essentially an elaborate marriage counseling session. The paperwork retraction process was almost as complicated as filing the original report. I had to provide my case number, confirm Kendra's personal information, and officially state that she was safe and had never been in danger. The officer explained that they'd have to update their records and remove her information from the missing person database, which required additional forms and documentation. I was basically undoing 4 days of official police work because my wife wanted to prove a point about bathroom cleaning. Kendra's reaction to learning about the police report aftermath was perhaps the most infuriating part of this entire situation. She seemed genuinely surprised that I'd involved law enforcement, like she'd expected me to just worry quietly at home without taking any action. When I explained that I'd have to call the police and retract the report, she shrugged and said she hoped it wouldn't be too much trouble. She was treating the waste of police resources like a minor inconvenience rather than a serious consequence of her actions. I spent the afternoon apologizing to my mother-in-law, the sergeant, and every person who'd helped search. Each conversation was more awkward than the last, with people struggling to understand why anyone would stage their own disappearance. Her mother's reaction was particularly uncomfortable. She'd been genuinely worried about Kendra and had even offered to drive down to help search for her. When I explained that Kendra had been fine the entire time and was just trying to teach me about household appreciation, there was this long silence on the phone. Her mother finally asked if Kendra was having some kind of breakdown, which made me realize that even her own family thought this behavior was completely insane. By the end, even the dispatcher was sympathetic, suggesting I try couples therapy next time. The professional consequences were starting to worry me too. I'd called in sick to work, telling my boss that I was dealing with a family emergency, and now I had to decide whether to tell them the truth about Kendra's elaborate prank or continue pretending there had been a real emergency. Kendra's complete lack of concern about the chaos she created was becoming more apparent as the consequences continued to unfold. She seemed annoyed that I was focusing on the practical aftermath of her disappearance rather than the lesson she'd intended to teach. when I mentioned that the police had wasted resources investigating her fake disappearance. She said that wasn't her problem, because she'd never asked me to call them in the first place. The ripple effects kept expanding as I realized how many people now knew about this situation. The police officers who'd worked on the case, the hospital staff I called, the neighbors who'd witnessed my searching, the friends and family members I'd contacted, and now potentially their friends and family members as word spread about the wife who'd staged her own disappearance to teach her husband about housework. My credibility was shot in ways I was only beginning to understand. These people had watched me panic for 4 days, seen me file police reports and call hospitals, witnessed my genuine terror about Kendra's safety. Now they knew that my wife had been perfectly fine the entire time and had orchestrated my breakdown as some kind of relationship education project. I looked like either a fool who didn't understand his own marriage or someone who'd been manipulated by a person capable of psychological warfare. Kendra's dismissive attitude toward these consequences was revealing something deeper about her character. She genuinely didn't seem to understand that her actions had impacts beyond our marriage. She'd involved the police, our families, our friends, and our community in her relationship experiment without considering how that would affect anyone else. She was treating the fallout like it was my fault for overreacting rather than her responsibility for creating the situation. The most disturbing realization was that this wasn't just about our relationship anymore. This was about my reputation, my credibility, and my standing in our community. Kendra had turned our marriage, problems into public entertainment, and now I was dealing with the social consequences of her decision to stage a disappearance. People were questioning my judgment, my awareness of my own marriage, and my ability to handle basic adult responsibilities. I was starting to understand that the missing person report was just the beginning of a much larger mess that would take months to clean up, assuming it ever could be cleaned up at all. But as I sat there processing the full scope of this disaster, something else was nagging at me. Kendra's plan had been too elaborate, too detailed, too perfectly executed for her to have come up with it entirely on her own. The more I thought about it, the more I realized she probably had help planning this whole nightmare. The worst part wasn't just that Kendra had orchestrated my 4-day panic attack. It was discovering that her friends had been part of the planning committee for this psychological warfare campaign. Claudia, Janice, and another friend turned my panic into reality TV in their living room, sitting around someone's kitchen table planning how to make me suffer, while they sipped wine and treated my mental health like a fun group activity. When I found out that Claudia had been hosting Kendra for 4 days while I called hospitals and filed missing person reports, I realized this wasn't just bad judgment from my wife. This was a coordinated effort by multiple grown women who thought psychological torture was an acceptable way to resolve relationship issues. Claudia had watched me stand on her doorstep, looking like I'd aged 10 years in 4 days, and she'd been in on the whole thing. She'd seen my relief and confusion when I found Kendra, and she'd known exactly why I looked like I was falling apart. The group dynamic became clearer as Kendra explained how her friends had encouraged this plan. They'd apparently been having regular discussions about my supposed failures as a husband, analyzing my behavior like I was some kind of laboratory specimen. They'd convinced Kendra that I was taking advantage of her and that she was essentially my unpaid maid and cook. These women had created an echo chamber where only their opinions mattered, and any perspective that didn't align with their narrative was dismissed as male ignorance or manipulation. What made this even more disturbing was learning that they'd been secretly filming my breakdown. Kendra mentioned that her friends had been documenting my reactions throughout the 4 days, capturing my increasing desperation for their own entertainment. They'd recorded videos of me searching neighborhoods, calling hospitals, and filing police reports. My genuine terror had become content for their twisted social experiment, complete with commentary and analysis of my performance as the unwitting star of their reality show. Janice had been particularly vocal about the need for dramatic action, according to Kendra. She'd shared stories about her own failed relationships and projected her bitter experiences onto our marriage. She'd convinced Kendra that subtle communication doesn't work with men, and that sometimes you need to shock them into awareness. The fact that multiple women had sat around encouraging psychological warfare as relationship therapy was almost more disturbing than Kendra's original plan. The way these friends had treated my panic as entertainment was becoming obvious as I learned more about their involvement. They'd known exactly what I was going through while I was calling everyone in Kendra's contact list, driving around neighborhoods looking for a car, and filing police reports. They'd been getting regular updates about my increasing desperation, and none of them had suggested that maybe this was going too far. They treated my breakdown like it was must-see television, complete with secret recordings they could review later. Kendra mentioned that her friends had been texting her throughout the 4 days, checking in about how I was handling her absence. They'd wanted to know if I was learning my lesson, if I was appreciating her contributions, if I was suffering enough to make the whole exercise worthwhile. They had turned my genuine terror into their personal entertainment project, documenting every moment of my breakdown for their own twisted satisfaction. The most infuriating part was how these women had convinced Kendra that this plan was not only acceptable, but necessary. They'd framed psychological manipulation as empowerment, telling her that she needed to take control of her relationship and show me who was really in charge. They'd made her believe that making me think she was dead was somehow a feminist statement about domestic labor and household appreciation. I started understanding that Kendra's friends had been working on her for months, gradually building up resentment about our marriage and convincing her that I was the problem. They'd taken normal relationship dynamics and twisted them into evidence of my supposed selfishness and lack of appreciation. They'd created a narrative where I was the villain and Kendra was the victim, and disappearing for 4 days was just giving me what I deserved. The group mentality had clearly taken over Kendra's judgment. She'd prioritized her friends' approval over my mental health, choosing to follow their advice rather than actually communicating with me about any problems in our marriage. These women had convinced her that their opinion about our relationship was more valuable than my actual feelings or our history together. They'd turn her against me without even knowing me well enough to make informed judgments. The satisfaction these women seemed to get from the chaos they'd helped create was deeply disturbing. Kendra mentioned that they'd been excited to hear about my reaction, asking for details about how worried I'd been and whether I'd learned my lesson. They treated my suffering like it was validation of their worldview about men and relationships. They'd gotten entertainment value out of watching me fall apart, and that seemed to be part of the appeal for them. I realized that Kendra's friends had essentially recruited her into their toxic approach to relationships. They'd convinced her that manipulation and psychological games were normal ways to handle marital issues. They'd created a support system based on shared resentment rather than actual problem solving, and Kendra had bought into their philosophy completely. She'd chosen their approval over our marriage. The fact that these women thought staging a disappearance was reasonable relationship advice revealed something deeply concerning about their understanding of healthy partnerships. It encouraged Kendra to treat me like an enemy rather than a partner, to use fear and panic as teaching tools, and to prioritize proving a point over actually resolving problems. They turned our marriage into a battlefield where I was the target and they were the strategists. What became clear was that Kendra had essentially chosen these women's twisted version of relationship advice over any attempt at actual communication with me. She let them convince her that I was the problem, that I wouldn't listen to reason, and that extreme measures were necessary to get through to me. She trusted their judgment about our marriage more than she trusted her own husband's capacity for understanding and change. By the time I understood the full scope of their involvement, I realized that this wasn't just about Kendra's poor judgment. This was about her choosing toxic friends over her marriage, prioritizing their approval over my mental health, and letting them turn our relationship into their personal entertainment project. My wife's support squad was less a cheering section and more a mob with popcorn. As I sat there processing everything Kendra had told me, a much darker realization was starting to take shape in my mind about what this whole situation really meant for our future. The relationship reality check. I was forced to confront a truth that had been staring me in the face throughout this entire nightmare. The woman I'd married, the person I'd shared 6 years of my life with, was capable of deliberately inflicting psychological torture on me and calling it education. I kept looking at her face, searching for some sign of the person I thought I knew. But all I could see was someone who'd planned my breakdown with the same attention to detail most people use to organize birthday parties. I loved her, but could I trust someone who weaponizes silence? The love I felt for Kendra was still there, but it was now mixed with something that felt like fear. Not physical fear, but the kind of deep unease you get when you realize you've been living with someone whose judgment is so fundamentally different from yours that you question everything about your shared reality. Trying to figure out how to rebuild trust after your spouse stages their own disappearance is like trying to solve a puzzle where half the pieces are missing and the other half are from a completely different box. Kendra seemed to expect that we'd just move forward normally now that she taught me her lesson about household appreciation. She was acting like we'd had a minor disagreement about dinner plans, not like she'd made me file police reports and call hospitals for 4 days. The casual way she discussed our future together was almost more disturbing than the original plan. The more I thought about it, the more I realized this wasn't actually about appreciation at all. If Kendra had wanted me to appreciate her contributions more, she could have talked to me about redistributing chores or finding ways to recognize her work around the house. Instead, she'd chosen to traumatize me as a teaching method, which suggested this was really about power and control. She wanted to prove that she could manipulate my emotions and make me dance to her tune whenever she decided I needed to learn a lesson. Our relationship dynamics had been completely destroyed by her 4-day disappearance. How do you have normal disagreements with someone who's proven they'll escalate household issues into psychological experiments? Every future argument will be shadowed by the knowledge that Kendra was capable of elaborate revenge schemes when she felt I wasn't listening to her properly. She'd set an impossible standard for conflict resolution where anything less than complete agreement could potentially result in another staged emergency. The practical implications of trying to move forward were becoming clearer as I thought about our day-to-day life. If Kendra felt unappreciated again, would she stage another disappearance? Would she escalate to something even more extreme? I'd be walking on eggshells for the rest of our marriage, constantly wondering if normal marital friction was building toward another elaborate lesson. She turned our relationship into a hostage situation where I was always one perceived slight away from another psychological attack. I kept trying to understand how someone recovers from this level of betrayal. Kendra had involved our friends, our families, law enforcement, and our community in her relationship experiment. She'd made my breakdown public entertainment and turned our marriage problems into neighborhood gossip. Even if I could somehow forgive her for terrorizing me, I couldn't undo the damage she'd done to my reputation and credibility. People would always remember me as the husband who didn't know his wife was hiding at her friend's house for 4 days. The impossibility of normal married life after this incident was becoming obvious. How do you argue about regular relationship issues when your spouse has proven they'll stage disappearances to win disagreements? Kendra had essentially destroyed any possibility of healthy conflict resolution by demonstrating that she'd use psychological manipulation rather than direct communication. She turned our marriage into a game where only she knew the rules, and those rules could change whenever she decided I needed another lesson. The friends who'd encouraged this plan were another ongoing problem that made rebuilding our relationship even more complicated. These women had convinced Kendra that psychological warfare was acceptable relationship advice, and they were still in her life, still influencing her decisions. I'd be competing with their toxic worldview for the rest of our marriage, trying to maintain a healthy relationship while Kendra's friends continued pushing her toward manipulation and control as problem-solving strategies. Kendra's expectation that I'd be grateful for this experience revealed something fundamental about her character that I'd somehow missed over 6 years of marriage. She genuinely believed that making me think she was dead was a reasonable response to feeling underappreciated. She convinced herself that my panic was educational rather than traumatic, that my 4 days of hell were actually a gift she'd given me to improve our relationship. The complete lack of empathy required to maintain that perspective was terrifying. I realized that some relationship lessons cost more than they're worth learning. Kendra had taught me that she was capable of elaborate psychological manipulation, that she prioritized her friends' approval over my mental health, and that she viewed our marriage as a power struggle rather than a partnership. These weren't lessons that strengthened our relationship. They were revelations that destroyed any possibility of moving forward together with trust and mutual respect. The most disturbing realization was that Kendra seemed proud of what she'd accomplished. She'd successfully made me suffer for 4 days, proven that she could manipulate my emotions, and demonstrated her power to involve our entire social network in her relationship experiments. She turned psychological abuse into an achievement, and she expected me to thank her for the experience. The complete breakdown of normal human empathy required to maintain that attitude was beyond anything I could work with or forgive. Sitting there looking at Kendra, I understood that this wasn't a relationship problem we could solve through better communication or marriage counseling. This was a fundamental incompatibility between someone who believed in healthy partnership and someone who used psychological torture as a teaching tool. Nothing felt the same. Have you ever faced betrayal that made you rethink everything? Let me know below, because looking back at this whole situation, I can see exactly how Kendra's grand plan to teach me appreciation was about to backfire in ways she never could have imagined. The whole scheme taught me something, but not what Kendra intended. Instead of appreciating household chores more, I learned that my wife preferred psychological manipulation over actual conversation. Her friends had turned our marriage into their entertainment project, complete with secret recordings and toxic advice sessions. Don't disappear to teach a lesson, talk it out. There's a huge difference between communicating about problems and staging elaborate revenge schemes. Kendra's plan backfired completely because extreme lessons tend to destroy trust rather than build appreciation. So what do you think? Did she cross a line, or was this justified relationship education? Drop your thoughts in the comments below. And if you've survived your own relationship disasters, hit subscribe, because apparently we're all just figuring this out as we go. Lesson learned. Next time I need thanks, I'll stick to flowers, not filing forms.